This will be Chapter 3 of the book What a Plant Knows by Daniel Chamovitz. Chapter 3 is about plants that can feel touch. The truth of the matter is they sense when they are being touched, and some can detect touch or contact at a greater sensitivity than humans. Too much shaking can actually stunt plants' growth. Too much touching. They can feel hot versus cold, and they respond to contact. So that means that they know they're being touched. To start with, we'll look at how humans sense touch. We have sensory neurons that are called mechanoreceptors that will detect touch and relay that signal to intermediary neurons, which in turn are connected to spinal cord neurons, which in turn relay the signal to the brain. The common principle in neuron communication is electricity. There is a potential difference, an electrical difference from one side of a neuron, one side of a membrane of a neuron to another, and that gets depolarized when the sensing occurs, when the detection occurs, and that depolarization is what's transmitted along one nerve to the next. In between, then, from one nerve to the next, calcium ions are very important. Within the neuron, different concentrations of potassium ions and sodium ions are what create the potential. So tendrils. Tendrils are the funny little curly things that plants use to attach themselves to structures for support. There's a lot of different plant parts and pieces that can become tendrils. They're not all specialized leaves, but nevertheless the principle is that something in the plant senses solid contact with something and then winds around it. So a response to touch. The spiraling is called nutating, by the way. And this is the example where these plants are much more sensitive than humans. The tendrils can be stroked by the tiniest piece of thread, and they will react to it at degrees of pressure that humans still can't detect anything. I'll show you a little video here of plants spiraling around. There's their nutation, winding around and around and around. This is time-lapse, so these aren't actually able to swing around like a lasso in the air. But you'll see in a second, we found a hard structure, and so the spiraling up continues. And then you can see there's new tendrils are still growing and are in the process. There, the guy on the left found his structure. So there we have detecting touch and physiological response to it. So a plant with rapid touch response is the Venus flytrap, Dionaea muscipula. Charles Darwin called these one of the most wonderful plants in the world. He was so fascinated with how they could do what they do. They grow in low nutrient areas, especially bogs, and that are very low in essential elements that plants need to grow on. And so to give themselves a little bit of fertilizer, they have figured out ways to catch insects and other small animals. And there's a lot of pitcher plants and sun drops that can do this, but by far the most spectacular is the Venus flytrap. And they secrete a little nectar to attract insects, so the insects are induced to climb around in the inside of their little traps. You can see his housefly seems to have something of a sense that he's in trouble, but he's actually licking at the surface of the trap there. And so eventually he gets himself farther in. The suspense is killing me. They stay closed a week to 10 days, and then they open back up and start all over again. So how does the plant sense its prey? It is, you know, obviously the fly was there for quite a while before he got shut in there. So, and this has taken some energy for that plant to manage to close. So it's in its best interest to be successful and not close too soon. Well, it turns out that there are large hairs, usually 6 trigger hairs on the surface, and the prey needs to trigger 2 of those hairs. If it just triggers 1, the plant won't close. And if it's the long enough period of time between triggers, the plant won't close. So it needs to be less than 20 seconds or so between 2 times that they're triggered. And this protects the plant from tiny insects and or rain or wind causing a trigger on one hair and not the other. And brushing against the hair creates a depolarization in both lobes of the trap, which is very similar to the calcium-sodium depolarization that happens in human mechanoreceptors. So how does a trap shut? The electrical signal acts on a group of specialized cells that together are called the pulvinus. And when the trap is open, these cells are full of water, so they're turgid. And this is due to pumping a lot of potassium ions into those cells, which causes water to flow in by osmosis. When the trap is triggered, the electrical potential causes the potassium ions to be pumped out of the cells, and so water leaves, also via osmosis. The cells get soft and flaccid, and so they no longer force so the tissue in the pulvinus becomes soft then, and it no longer forces the 2 halves of the trap open. And so this is essentially the same thing as when just a plant wilts. So these cells are able to wilt quickly. Additionally, what makes it happen so quickly is these faces of the trap are sort of under tension, like if you cut a tennis ball in half and then turned it inside out. You know how with just the right a little bit of pressure, then it wants to flop back to its normal structure, normal status, and this is kind of the same thing. As soon as those cells welt a little bit, then the tension is released and the trap shuts. Sensitive plants, another case of plants sensing touch and responding. This is a member of the legume family, Mimulus puticus, and it's similar to Venus flytrap. It has pulvinus cells right at the bottoms of all the little leaflets and at the very bottom of the leaf where it is attached to the petiole. The cells near the pulvinus are considered mechanoreceptors. They found some specialized red cells. They're red because they have a lot of lignin in them, and they think that's important to some of the signaling. So those cells detect pressure, detect touch, and then they cause the pulvinus to cause the wilting, just like we did with and you can see how the message is being sent down to other parts of the leaflet that weren't actually touched. So some other observations that suggest other ways that plants detect touch. One of the initial was a scientist who was just measuring the growth of cockleburs, and so he went out to the field, every day for a certain period of time and measured the same leaves on the same plants, and he noticed that the repeatedly measured leaves died or turned brown, and others on the same plant and other plants around didn't show this at all. Similarly, Arabidopsis, which is a commonly used research plant for laboratory research, those that are touched a few times a day or more frequently grow shorter and stouter, and even their flowering period is changed from plants that aren't touched. And this has been repeated with other species. Not all of them respond the same way, and some actually seem to do better with touch, but by and large there is a physiological response. And this even comes to plants being sprayed with water, so they're not even actually touched by human hands. They're just being touched by water. But those same plants that will react to water will respond when being touched. So how are they responding? This is called thigmomorphogenesis. Thigmo meaning touch, morpho meaning physical shape change, and genesis meaning development or origination. The receptor is not known. It could be just changes in the cell status due to pressure, whether cells have been slightly damaged or just squeezed enough that the pressure was able to be detected, or something was damaged enough that it results in response to pressure. We have figured out, though, that scientists have figured out that dozens of genes throughout the plant are activated by touch or tissue damage from heating. Also will do the same thing. So the plant is detecting touch, and these numerous genes are responding with protein production and physiological changes in the plant. The categories of genes being activated, obviously they haven't all been categorized, but in general they seem to be genes that are involved with electrical signaling. So again, back to that neuronal system in humans that is similar to the electrical signals that plants have, and often these are calcium regulating proteins that are the products of those genes. Hormonal genes, which also are likely involved in signaling, and also growth responses are stimulated. Cell wall modification genes are stimulated, and that could be part of why some of the plants are more stunted when they're have been touched a lot. And additionally, all of these allow the plant, come together to allow the plant to react to a changed environment. This is a very active field of plant research, so a lot of things are not known about this, but it does come down to a plant that perhaps senses it's in where a really windy area, then could grow differently. Think of the plants at the top of mountains that they obviously have had a physiological response to change their shape and bend away from the wind, whereas the same species growing in a protected area grows very differently. So whether touch is detected by specialized hairs, specialized cells, or just unknown changes within the tissue, plants do indeed detect touch, and they do react to touch. So the signal is converted to a physiological response, which would be what animals would call touch, all of which comes together by information to the plant that allows it to adapt to not being able to move, and yet being able to react to its environment, whether it's wind or predation or whatever else might be happening to that plant. Touch is important. That concludes Chapter 3.